I came home from my sister's funeral on a Tuesday, and by Friday my son-in-law had changed the locks. Not metaphorically, literally. The key I'd used for 11 years, the spare my daughter had pressed into my palm the day they moved into that house on Birchwood Lane, the one I'd used to water her plants when they went to Cancun, to let the plumber in when her husband was traveling, to bring soup when the grandchildren had strep throat, that key no longer fit the lock. I stood on the porch in the November cold, my overnight bag still in my hand, still wearing the black dress I'd worn to bury my sister, and I twisted that key back and forth until my wrist hurt. Then the door opened from the inside. My son-in-law was standing there in his weekend clothes, a flannel shirt, jeans, the ones with the tear at the knee he refused to throw out. He was holding a cup of coffee like it was any ordinary Saturday morning. He looked at the key in my hand. He looked at my face. And then he said, very calmly, the way he said everything, "Oh, I should have called you. We had the locks rekeyed last week. Security thing. Security thing." I had lived in that house for 3 years, not as a guest. As the person who took the children to school when my daughter worked the early shift at the hospital, as the person who made dinner on the nights my son-in-law flew to Chicago or Dallas or wherever it was the firm needed him that week. I had a room there. A room with a quilt my mother had made, with a framed photograph of my late husband on the nightstand, with a drawer full of my cardigans, and now he was telling me it was a security thing. My daughter appeared behind him. She had her work expression on, the careful one, the one she wore when she was managing a difficult patient. "Mom," she said, "come in. We need to talk." I want to be honest about what happened in that living room because I've told this story enough times now that I've learned which parts people want to hear and which parts are harder to explain. The part people want to hear is the ending. The part that's harder to explain is how a woman my age, a woman who had raised a child alone after her husband died at 53, a woman who had worked 31 years as a bookkeeper and never once bounced a check in her life, how that woman could have been so completely unprepared for what her daughter said next. "We think it's time," my daughter said, "for you to have your own space." My own space. I looked at her. Then at him. He had sat down in the armchair by the window, my husband's chair, the one I'd brought from our old house when I moved in, and he was looking at his coffee cup. "I just got back from burying Harriet," I said. My voice came out strange. Thin. "I've been gone 4 days. I know, Mom. And I'm so sorry about Aunt Harriet. I really am. But we've been talking about this for a while, and—" She paused, glanced at her husband. He didn't look up. "We think you'd be happier somewhere with people your own age, maybe one of those senior communities. The one off Route 9 is supposed to be really nice. The one off Route 9. I knew that place. I had driven past it 100 times. It had a sign with a sunrise on it and a name like Meadow Glen or Golden something. I had never once imagined myself inside it. My overnight bag was still in my hand. I realized I was still holding it. I set it down on the floor very deliberately, the way you do when you're trying not to let anyone see that your hands are shaking. "Where are my things?" I said. My daughter blinked. "What?" "My things. In my room. My mother's quilt. Harold's photograph. My cardigans." Something passed across her face. Guilt, maybe, or the thing that sits next to guilt when someone has already decided what they're going to do and doesn't want to be talked out of it. "They're in the room," she said. "Of course they are. Mom, we're not throwing you out. We just think, I'd like to get them now," I said, "if that's all right." It was not all right, exactly, but she didn't stop me. I went down the hall to the room that had been mine for 3 years. The quilt was on the bed. Harold's photograph was on the nightstand. My cardigans were in the drawer, folded the way I fold them, the way my mother taught me, sleeves crossed in the back. I stood in the middle of that room for a long moment and looked at all of it. Then I got the suitcase from the closet and I started to pack. My son-in-law drove me to the extended stay on Route 12. He carried my bags to the door of the room without being asked, which I suppose was meant to be generous. The room had a laminate dresser and a coffee maker and a window that looked out at the highway. He said he'd have my daughter call me in a few days once things had settled. I nodded. He left. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Harold's photograph, which I'd propped on the dresser. "Well," I said to him, "here we are." Harold had been gone for 9 years, but I still talked to him. I expect I always will. I had $2,300 in my checking account. My Social Security came in on the 15th. The extended stay cost $79 a night, which I did the math on immediately, the way a bookkeeper does. 79 on times 30 is $2,370, which is more than $2,300. I had a small pension from the firm where I'd worked, and that helped, but not enough to stay somewhere decent indefinitely. I had no idea what indefinitely was going to mean. What I had, in addition to my 2 suitcases and Harold's photograph and my mother's quilt, was a brown accordion folder that I'd grabbed from the shelf in my room without quite knowing why. It was old. The elastic band had cracked, and I'd replaced it twice with rubber bands, and it had been sitting on that shelf for the entire 3 years I'd lived in my daughter's house without me ever opening it. It had belonged to Harold's mother. Her name was Eugenia, and she had died 6 months before Harold, which meant I had been too deep in grief when she went to do much more than box up her things and stack them in the corner of whatever room I happened to be occupying at the time. Eugenia had not been a warm woman. She'd been precise and a little formal, the kind of woman who wore a slip under every dress and kept her handwriting perfectly even, but she had been Harold's mother, and that had been enough for me. I didn't open the folder that night. I was too tired. I cried a little, ate crackers from a sleeve I found in my bag, called my friend Marvella in Tucson, and told her what had happened. Marvella said things that were equal parts comforting and furious, which is what I needed. Then I turned off the light and lay in the dark listening to the highway and tried to remember who I was. I was 67 years old. I was a widow. I was a mother, though that word felt complicated now. I was a bookkeeper, retired. I was the daughter of 2 people who were gone, the sister of a woman I'd just buried, the granddaughter of a woman I'd barely known. I was a woman sitting in a motel room with $2,300 and a cracked accordion folder. I opened the folder in the morning. Eugenia had been meticulous. Of course she had. The papers inside were organized in a way that made the bookkeeper in me feel an immediate kinship. Receipts clipped together, letters in chronological order, legal documents in their own section marked with little paper tabs in her precise handwriting. I sat at the laminate desk with a cup of the terrible coffee maker coffee and went through it all slowly. Most of it was what you'd expect: property records for a house that had been sold, insurance documents, Harold's birth certificate, a letter from a cousin in Ohio dated 1987. And then, near the back of the folder, in a section Eugenia had labeled simply business in her small, careful hand, a partnership agreement. It was 11 pages long, typed on paper that had yellowed at the edges. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, more slowly. Eugenia had been a silent partner in a ceramic studio, not a hobby studio, a commercial one. She and a woman named Agnes had founded it in 1971 in a building on Hargrove Street in the city, and according to the agreement, any dissolution of the partnership or sale of the business required the consent of both parties or their legal heirs. Agnes. I had no idea who Agnes was. I'd never heard Eugenia mention her. I'd never heard Harold mention her, but her signature was on every page of that document, right next to Eugenia's, in a looping hand that was the exact opposite of Eugenia's careful print. I sat with that folder for a long time. Then I put on my coat and drove to Hargrove Street. The building was still there. That was the first thing. The building was still there, which I hadn't expected. It was brick, 3 stories, with large windows on the ground floor that had the particular look of a place that had been something specific once and then become something more generic. There was a sign for a graphic design firm on the 2nd floor. The ground floor appeared to be a showroom of some kind, a ceramics showroom. I stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and looked at the sign in the window. It said in clean modern lettering, Hargrove Ceramic Works, EST, 1971, 54 years. I went inside. The woman at the front desk was young, early 30s, dark hair, the efficient manner of someone who dealt with walk-ins all day. I told her I was looking for information about the business's original partnership. She looked at me the way young people sometimes look at older women who say unexpected things, politely skeptical, waiting for more context. I believe my late mother-in-law was a founding partner, I said. I have the original partnership agreement. The efficient manner disappeared. She picked up the phone. The woman who came out from the back was not young. She was perhaps 75, small and angular, with the kind of white hair that had clearly once been vivid red, and she walked with a cane but moved quickly anyway, like someone who found the cane annoying. She stopped when she saw me, and something crossed her face that I couldn't immediately read. "You look like Eugenia," she said. "I'm her daughter-in-law," I said. And then I gave my name. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You'd better come to my office." Agnes was 91 years old and still came in 4 days a week. This was the first thing she told me, and I understood that it was not a boast but an explanation. She was telling me who she was, the kind of woman she was, before we got to the harder conversation. The harder conversation took about an hour. The ceramics business had not remained small. In 1971, it had been a studio. By 1985, it had a wholesale operation. By 1995, it had 3 retail locations. It had been sold, the retail locations, in 2008 to a larger home goods company, and the proceeds had been significant. Agnes had assumed when Eugenia died that she would be contacted by Eugenia's estate. She had not been. She had consulted her attorney. She had waited. She had been waiting for 4 years. "How did you find me?" she asked. I put the accordion folder on her desk. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she looked at me, and her eyes were very bright. "Eugenia kept it," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "She kept everything," I said. Agnes called her attorney from the office while I sat there. She put him on speaker without asking if that was all right, which I found I didn't mind. He asked me several questions: my name, my relationship to Eugenia, whether I was the sole heir or one of several, whether I had already consulted an attorney of my own. I answered honestly. I had not consulted an attorney. I had found the folder that morning. I had not known any of this existed before today. There was a pause on the phone. Then the attorney said carefully, "Mrs.," and used my name. "I think you're going to want to have someone represent your interests before we go much further." I looked at Agnes. She was looking at me with an expression that I would spend some time thinking about afterward, not unkind, not calculating, but clear. The expression of a woman who had been in business for 50 years and knew that clarity was the kindest thing you could offer someone. "He's right," she said. I found an attorney through the Bar Association's referral line. His name was a cheerful mouthful that I had to write down, and he worked out of an office above a dry cleaner on Pemberton Avenue and had a desk so buried in files that I could barely see him when I sat across from it. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with reading glasses he kept losing and finding again, and he had the slightly distracted air of a man who was always thinking about 3 things at once. He read the partnership agreement without speaking. When he finished, he read it again. Then he took off his reading glasses and set them on top of a file folder and looked at me. "Where have you been?" he said. "I beg your pardon." "This agreement, you've had it this whole time?" "I didn't know I had it," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "The sale of those retail locations in 2008, your mother-in-law's estate should have been notified. Her heirs should have received a portion of the proceeds. She died in 2015, I said. The proceeds would have come to Harold. But Harold died 6 months later. And Harold's estate? I handled it myself, I said. I was a bookkeeper for 30 years. I was careful. But I didn't know about this." He put his reading glasses back on and looked at the agreement again. "That's the thing about documents," he said. More to himself than to me. They just sit there, waiting. I don't want to tell this part too quickly, because I have sat in enough rooms while attorneys talk to understand that the law moves at its own pace and the details matter, and anyone who promises you a fast or simple outcomes is someone you should be cautious about. My attorney was not that kind of person. He was careful and methodical, and he had a habit of reading sentences aloud to himself that I came to find oddly reassuring, the way you find reassuring any sign that someone is paying close attention. What he found over the following weeks was this. The partnership agreement had a clause that addressed the sale of any portion of the business. The retail locations, when sold in 2008, had generated proceeds that should have been partially distributed to Eugenia as a silent partner. They had not been, because Agnes's previous attorney, now deceased, had apparently not pursued the matter after Eugenia failed to respond, and Eugenia, who had been dealing with her own declining health, had apparently not known about the sale. There was also the matter of ongoing licensing fees. The Hargrove Ceramic Works had licensed its original designs that Eugenia had contributed to, whose provenance was documented in several early letters in the accordion folder, to the company that bought the retail operations. Those fees had been paid to Agnes's side of the partnership for 17 years. My attorney called Agnes's attorney. Agnes's attorney called my attorney. There were several phone calls during which I was not present, and several meetings during which I was. Agnes herself was not hostile. I want to be clear about that. She had not tried to cheat Eugenia. She had tried to reach Eugenia and been unable to, and then Eugenia had died, and then the situation had become complicated in the way that situations become complicated when people are grieving and overwhelmed and don't know what they don't know. Agnes told me this herself in her office on a December afternoon when the light through the big windows was thin and gray and the showroom below us was quiet. I should have tried harder, she said. You didn't know Harold had died, I said. No. She looked at her hands. They were spotted with age, but steady. I'm sorry you're only finding this now. I'm sorry too, I said, but I'm glad I found it. She looked up at me then, and this time the expression I couldn't quite read before became clear. It was relief. The particular relief of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has finally been able to set it down. I called my daughter the week before Christmas. I had not spoken to her since the morning I'd left the house on Birchwood Lane. Her husband had texted once to say they hoped I was settling in. I had not responded to that. But it was almost Christmas, and she had children, my grandchildren, and I was not going to let what had happened make me a stranger to them. She answered on the second ring. Mom, she said, and I could hear everything in that one word, the guilt, the relief that I'd called, the not quite readiness to talk about any of it. I'm not calling to fight, I said. I want to see the kids. A breath. Yes, of course. They miss you. Good, I said. I miss them too. There was a pause. Then, Mom, where are you staying? Are you okay? I thought about the extended stay on Route 12, where I had stayed for 2 weeks before finding a furnished apartment on the third floor of a building near the park, the one with the drafty windows I'd sealed with weather stripping and the radiator that knocked every morning at 5 like a polite alarm. I'm more than okay, I said. I don't know what I expected her to say to that. Maybe I expected her to push, to ask what I meant. But she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I'm glad, and she sounded like she meant it, and I decided that was enough for now. The settlement took 5 months to finalize. I won't give you the specific number, because it was my attorney's strong advice not to, and I've found that his advice tends to be worth following. What I will tell you is that it was enough to change the shape of the rest of my life. Enough that when I signed the final documents in my attorney's office, he found his glasses twice during the signing, which had become a thing I counted on. I sat in my car afterward in the parking lot above the dry cleaner and cried in a way I hadn't cried since Harold died, not from sadness. From something more complicated, gratitude, maybe, and something that took me a while to name. What I finally understood sitting in that parking lot was this. Eugenia had kept that folder for 50 years. She had labeled the sections in her careful hand. She had updated the elastic band. I found where she'd taped a note to herself inside the cover, reminding herself to replace it, and she had moved it from house to house and kept it current and never once mentioned it to anyone, as far as I could tell. She had not been a warm woman. She had been precise. And her precision had been, it turned out, a form of love, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that does its work quietly and trusts that you'll find it when you need it. I have a different apartment now. Not the drafty one. A proper one, in a building near the botanical garden, with windows that face east so the morning light comes in flat and clear, and I can drink my coffee and watch the garden change with the seasons. I have my mother's quilt on the bed and Harold's photograph on the nightstand, and Eugenia's accordion folder in the fireproof box I bought specifically to hold it. My daughter and I have had the harder conversations. We've had them more than once, in the careful way that people who love each other and have hurt each other have to learn to talk. Her husband and I have a cordial distance that I think is probably permanent, and I've made my peace with that. My grandchildren come to see me every other Saturday, and we bake things and play cards, and I tell them about Harold and about Harriet and about Eugenia, whose name they had never heard before. Last spring, Agnes invited me to the studio's anniversary event, 54 years of Hargrove Ceramic Works. She gave a short speech in which she mentioned, without naming me, that the founding of the business had been a partnership in every sense of the word, and that the best business decisions she'd ever made were the ones she'd made with someone she trusted. Afterward, she found me near the display of original pieces from 1971, small and uneven and full of the confident imperfection of people who were just beginning, and she put her hand on my arm. Eugenia would have liked you, she said. She didn't particularly, I said. Agnes laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, nothing like what I expected, and it made me like her immediately in a way I hadn't quite managed to before. No, she said. She wasn't easy to like, but she would have respected you. That was better with Eugenia. I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about a woman who replaced the elastic band on a folder and never said a word about it. I thought about what it means to do things carefully and trust that it matters, even when no one is watching, even when you'll never see the outcome. I was 67 when I stood on my daughter's porch with a key that no longer worked, holding my overnight bag, still in my funeral dress, with nothing but the habit of paying attention and an old folder I hadn't thought to open. That was enough. It turned out that was more than enough.